All right. Hey everyone, welcome to our presentation about grad implementations. We are going to go through our suggested ways of navigating through your implementation journey. My name is Laura Bald. I am the manager of enrollment implementations and a senior slate strategist in Carnegie's slate optimization team. At Carnegie, we boast the country's largest dedicated slate team with 32 full-time dedicated slate strategists, all of whom have years of personal work experience in higher ed. I myself worked at Portland State University in the graduate business programs as the admissions and systems manager. I completed my MS degree in the Applied Information Management program at University of Oregon, and I am a green, yellow, and pink and sophisticated and curious researcher. And if you don't know what that means, those are my colors and archetype, which are a product of our psychographic research. This tells you that I'm driven by the quest for the unknown and a need to invent the future through innovative and sophisticated solutions, which is really just a fancy way for you to know that I'm obsessed with implementing slate every single day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Pouchak, Director of Special Projects for the Office of the Vice Chancellor at MIT, and we oversee both undergraduate and graduate education. I work on a variety of different projects, but I've been involved in our slate pilot for grad admissions over the last year with our mechanical engineering group and with Carnegie, specifically very closely with Laura. And I have previous experience in migrating legacy database systems at two other institutions, including Northeastern University and Worcester Polytech. And I'll tell you a little bit about MIT. So we have 138 graduate degree programs that live in about 38 departments, as well as a handful of joint programs. More than 90% of our doctoral students are supported by fellowships, research assistantships, or teaching assistantships. And admissions at MIT to graduate programs is very decentralized and distributed. So applicants apply directly to the department or degree program, not to our Office of Graduate Education. And just to make a note that each of the teams within these programs that support graduate admissions are very staffed and resourced very differently.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kayla Elliott Miller. I'm the Senior Systems Manager at Ball State University, and I've been our slate captain for graduate admissions since our implementation in 2018. And I have previously also supported our application processing team for both graduate and international admissions. So a little bit about Ball State. We have more than 100 graduate programs across 7 academic colleges. And we have what we like to think of a centralized admissions process where applications come into graduate admissions, then back out to the departments, and then back to graduate admissions for that final decision. And because of this model, we have more than 250 faculty and staff users in our slate instance specifically for grad. We process approximately 4,500 applications annually across fall, spring, and summer. And our graduate admissions team is within the Division of Enrollment Planning and Management, not within the graduate school. Prior to slate, we had no CRM for graduate admissions. And so when we went into our implementation, we shared with our undergrad counterparts back in 2018. And we have 2 full-time slate gurus supporting our instance.
So for today's agenda, we are going to start with how to begin an implementation. Some of you might already be implemented, some of you might already be in the process, but we're hoping that no matter where you are in the process, that you do take some details away and some great tips. Sorry. Then we're going to go into slate solutions. So we have a couple of complex scenarios that we think that we can provide some interesting ideas and thoughts around. We'll touch on some really helpful user resources, and then Kayla and Lauren will go into some lessons learned from their experiences of implementing, and then we'll dive into questions and answers. So how to begin? Before diving into slate, there's a lot of work to be done outside of the system. Any successful system implementation requires pre-planning, stakeholder engagement and buy-in, and realistic timelines and milestones. While this is true across the board with any implementation, the added complexity and numerous and varied stakeholder needs in a graduate implementation mean that this planning phase is absolutely imperative. Take time to map it out. If you can't write it out on paper, you can't build it. So one of the first things you'll need to consider is how many databases you'll need to get. There are a lot of scenarios where you'll greatly benefit from considering more than one instance for your implementation if you have the budget for it. Are both grad and undergrad implementing? Is there a particular grad program that may benefit from their own instance? Are you considering student success and advancement down the road? You'll really want to consider all the pros and cons before deciding. The pros of one database is it's cheaper. It's one less instance to implement. It's only one instance to maintain. If you have fewer fiscal and human resources, one instance could be best. But if you have the resources to maintain more than one database, then you'll want to consider how different your processes will be from the population you'd be sharing with. How different or similar are your processes? And internally, do you play nice with each other? Meaning, okay, yeah, you might get along with everyone, but are you going to want to make concessions for some of your processes for the other population? Do you work closely together? Are you going to be in contact with them and easily be able to give someone a call and say, hey, I want to change this rule. Is that okay with you? A shared instance means you'll always need to consider any changes you make and how they may affect the other folks involved. We know how different graduate processes and needs can be, hence this presentation. So with a unique instance just for grad, you'll really be able to build and maintain with only grad in mind. Also, when in doubt, ask Technolutions. They have advice, they have ideas, and they have examples. Lauren, do you want to tell us a little bit about how MIT decided to go with different instances?
Yeah, sure. So we actually have 3 separate instances at MIT. Our business school, Sloan, has been on Slate for quite a few years. Our undergraduate admissions team made the transition last year to Slate. And so now we have a 3rd instance for our graduate research program. So we have 3 separate instances.
And Kayla, you are working in one instance. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for Ball State, it was a pretty easy decision. Our undergraduate and graduate admissions offices are both within the under shared leadership within the Division of Enrollment Planning and Management. And we have one operations and technology team that supports all of our admissions units. So it was very seamless to make that decision at one time. We had everyone around the table and we could make the decisions needed that would not negatively impact any of our audiences. A very collaborative approach.
So if you've already implemented one instance and you're starting to think that there may be benefit from splitting into a second, talk to your Technolution success managers, and they may be able to even clone your current instance so you don't have to start from scratch. Or you do start from scratch because it could be a really great opportunity to expand and reassess your processes. So now we need to think about who's involved. Who's going to be leading the project? Most of the successful implementations we see are led by the admissions teams. These are the people who know the ins and outs of processes and who work closest with the internal end users as well as who have the closest insight as to what the student experience is. Slate should be built more from this context, which is why you don't often see the IT department leading this project. It's just really not necessary. Who's your project sponsor? Having someone or multiple someones who can provide support and resources as well as make high-level decisions and promote change is imperative. We've seen implementations that have failed simply because no one felt empowered to make decisions or had someone to go to make those decisions, and every portion of the project ended in a stalemate. You cannot and should not move forward without this sponsor. Then what departments or colleges are on board? Who do you need to get on board? If you're working in a more decentralized model, having departments on board from the beginning is key. They're the ones that are informing the processes, and they're the ones that are going to have to agree to adopt the new system. They're also the ones that need to be on board to change in processes. Not everyone will fully get their way, and change management is a lot easier if change is not a surprise. It's sometimes not always necessary, though, to get everyone on board right away. Some really successful implementations we've seen have used a rollout method, where 1 or 2 heavily invested departments are implemented first, and you work with them, perfect the system, and use those as examples for additional departments to join. So one example of that is MIT's grad instance. Lauren, tell us more about that.
Sure. So we've had a little bit of a wandering journey for our graduate admissions programs. And we started talking about this probably 2 years ago. We really wanted to move away from our homegrown system. It didn't really provide a CRM. There wasn't really the automation that Slate provides. And many of our grad programs are looking to go off on their own to do different things. But what happened was we met with a lot of stakeholders and got some momentum, but then the pandemic sort of put things on the back burner. And sort of in the middle, our mechanical engineering department decided, hey, we're just going to do this. We're going to go off on our own and implement Slate. So we said, wait, hold on, let's put together a team to make this work. So we pulled together a team from mechanical engineering, myself in the Office of the Vice Chancellor, IS&T, and our Office of Graduate Education. So really, MECI was driving the project along with Carnegie, but my role was kind of just to think about, hey, I would constantly ask, like, how this works for MECI, but how's this going to work for other departments, knowing that we would want to roll other people into Slate as we kind of kept going. So now we're really using now that we've had a full year cycle for the process with MECI, we're able to say, this is what it looks like. And we're kind of using them as a template for other programs to say, okay, how can we customize this application? How can we change these reading bins for what we need? So it's really worked great for us.
I think that is one of my favorite methods for rolling out in grad programs. So if you do have the ability to do that, I would highly encourage it. But if you do work in a more centralized model where the graduate admissions office is designed to set more of the overall decisions that departments should adopt, you may decide it makes sense to build your instance without as much departmental input up front and bring them in later down the road. However, in order to get users into your system more quickly and efficiently, we'd highly recommend keeping departments and users updated consistently and develop some sort of training model and feedback model so you're not inundated with questions and requests once you go live. Kayla, can you tell us a little bit about your experience implementing under more of a mixed model?
For us, as I mentioned earlier, our graduate admissions and admissions operations team are in the Division of Enrollment Planning and Management. We have a strong partnership with the graduate school, and we really leaned into our relationship with the dean of the graduate school to serve as a liaison for us in those early conversations with our academic units. And then we also, to keep those program directors engaged throughout our implementation, we hosted monthly coffee chats so we could provide updates on the status of the project, the status of implementation, ask for feedback, and address any of those questions or concerns as we went along.
So as you can see, whether or not you're in a centralized, decentralized, or mixed model, you must really plan on having a central Slate administrators team though. There are plenty of aspects of Slate that you can segment, which we'll discuss further in the next section, but there's always going to be aspects of the system that, if modified, could have rippling effects across the instance. I do recommend having a central grad office. You need someone who understands and is involved in the academic processes. Just make sure you're always in good and constant communication with your IT department about any changes that would affect an integration. Otherwise, any trust in your management of the system will be lost, and you don't want to face the angry emails and calls that come with a broken integration feed. So now we think about, what do we care about for our system? Start mapping out the processes. Literally map it out. Get paper and pen, find a whiteboard, grab some Post-it notes, think through your funnel and what happens at each stage. How do people get into the system? How do applicants become engaged? What's their application experience? And what's the review process like? Which I find that one to be really fun to map. And MIT had a great example of how they mapped the reader workflow. They brought this to one of our calls and we built out the initial structure of the reader bin in about 10 minutes. We then spent a lot more calls fine tuning, of course, but couldn't have gotten there without this initial work. I also love this example from Slate Knowledge Base that I love showing our partner schools as one of the best ways to map checklist requirements. It's a super easy and clean way to document and map requirements while still maintaining the various complex levels of different populations and groups. And translating this into Slate is a breeze. So as you're mapping these processes, ask yourself my favorite question, why? Why are we doing it this way? Why do we need this data? If your answer is we've always done it this way, then stop doing it because that's not a good enough reason. If your answer is because it's the only way we could do it in insert old CRM here, then it's time to get your creative juices flowing because you can now build it the way you've always wanted to. One aspect that will always come up during these processes is how do we need to get this into our SIS? I've had to delicately tell many schools, I don't really care what your SIS needs right now. We don't want to build your system based on your SIS needs. Slate is really, really flexible and can export your data in whatever way your external system needs. Build the system based on your processes, user, and student needs only. Okay, now it's time to get into Slate. We want to get into a couple focused areas that can be particularly challenging for grad implementations: permissioning and managing deadlines. Depending on where you are in your Slate journey right now, you may not be ready to jump into the nitty-gritty of configurable joins, entities, populations, rules, etc. But we want to give you some high-level ideas to get your wheels turning. First, we'll get into permissions. Slate has 3 primary levels of permissions. The first is user permissions, which is what can a user do. Realms, which is which objects can it be done to. And by objects, I mean events, forms, queries, etc. And population permissions, to whom can it be done. At the grad level, you may end up using all 3 of these types of permissions, especially population permissions, which I'll go into further in a second. But a word of advice, don't let this bog down your implementation. You may not be ready to define everything until the very end. Knowing the possibilities is helpful, but our recommendation is to start small and conservative and take time to slowly build more robust permission levels. When you are ready to start building out, though, population permissions are one of the best features for grad programs. Many schools may want each department to only see inquiries and applicants that are relevant to their department. Or in a shared instance, they may want to segment the undergrad from the grad records. Population permissions are the way to do that. So I do have an example of this. All right, so here we have someone looking up Mark Spector. We go to his record and you can see that he is a master's student and he's in the population of permission graduate. Now we're going to search for Stephen Grant. Stephen's a freshman and in the permission of undergraduate. We're now going to impersonate someone who has the permission graduate population and search for Stephen Grant, who we know is an undergraduate. Can't find them at all. Then we're going to go search for Mark Spector, who is there. So seemingly super simple, but it's, again, really helpful to segment. You can also give population permissions to certain people and not others. So maybe faculty, you just really want to make things easy for them and be able to find exactly who they need to find. But maybe someone who's in admissions processing does need to see everyone. So you can, of course, delegate who needs to be able to see what based on the person as well. So one thing I hadn't mentioned in the earlier slide was custom permissions. Custom permissions are a way of creating a specific permission that ties a role or a user to a specific element in Slate. And the best use case for this is to show or hide reader bins. So here's a bin structure that has no custom permissions. You can see every bin that exists in the workflow. But then let's add custom permissions to faculty review to some of the bins, add grad office review to all of the others, and then impersonate someone who only has the faculty review custom permission. And now you can only see the 3 bins that have that custom permission. When you have a lot of faculty and academic directors reviewing applicants, you want to make things super easy for them while also protecting the rest of the processes. Simplifying the bin structure through these permissions is incredibly helpful, and it's an often overlooked feature. As you begin to build, and if you feel yourself getting overwhelmed with the user permissions, feel free to scan the QR code to be taken to our guide that we created for our partner schools through our experience as a preferred partner and users of Slate. We hope it's helpful.
I have to interrupt here and give a shout out for one of my personal favorite Slate features, which is impersonation. This is extremely helpful during implementation and testing, but I find myself using it regularly to ensure that Faculty Bob can only see what I want Faculty Bob to see.
So true. And if you want to make things really easy, you might even want to make an additional user account that's maybe just an external user just for your use of impersonating. So you can log into one window, impersonate, and you can be working in your other user account in another window. rather than going back and forth. So yes, absolutely impersonate always. Okay, so on to everyone's favorite topic, deadlines. I think every school I've worked with has managed their deadlines differently in Slate. Some have hundreds of deadlines that need to be maintained. Others have decided on one primary deadline and depend on the programs and departments to communicate to their applicants appropriately. In the Slate knowledge base, there's a great knowledge base article titled Deadline Management that includes several primary ways to manage and use deadlines in Slate. My go-to is using page keys and hard fails, so an applicant can still see the application, but may not be able to submit if their chosen program deadlines have passed. So this is the use of a hard fail. So if they meet this criteria, then they will get a notification like this before they submit, which tells them that their program deadline has passed and they need to either make another selection, or I might add a note that they should contact the department that they're trying to apply for. There's also prompt logic that can be really useful. So directly onto the prompt of nutrition option, you can add the dates, the deadline dates. This is really granular and helpful, but it's also a lot to maintain. You can also add expiration dates directly onto the prompts, although this does affect the prompt system-wide, so it would also affect what shows up on the inquiry and event forms. So I don't often use this one, but it is a feature that I have seen schools utilize. If you're looking for a more advanced solution, you can also consider utilizing form field formulas that calculate and compare the program's deadlines to the current date, but they can be a little finicky, so always do tons of testing. Deciding on what the applicant experience of a deadline, if a deadline has passed, is one thing to consider in making your decision, but the more challenging aspect is the long-term maintenance of many different deadlines. If you have 78 different deadlines, you probably want to avoid the prompt logic method and opt for page keys and or hard fails instead. But even with those, it can be tricky to confirm that every single filter for every single deadline has been updated. Luckily, there are a couple of great ways that deadline dates can be housed centrally, making maintenance much more sustainable each year. The first place is translation codes. Translation codes allow you to take any value and export a different value. Utilizing translation codes means that you would only have to update dates in one place, which can easily be done in bulk using a source format, and then referenced through filters in your hard fail or page key. If a program only has one deadline per program, it's easy enough to do a one-to-one relationship from program to deadline in the filters. But if a program has multiple deadlines, you may have to get a little more fancy utilizing concatenation and comparison filters. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly as I want to highlight the general concept and use cases, but please don't hesitate to come talk to me after the session if you want to go further into the technicalities. This is really fun for me, so I might geek out a little. So translation codes work really well. This is a translation code setup. So what you can see here is the different programs along with the term. So fall criminal justice, I would want to export September 15th. We have spring psychology, deadline of December 31st. If you go into the translation code, you can see the value that I'm looking for is summer psychology. And when I see summer psychology, I want to export the value of March 1st, 2022. So I'm going to leave that up here while we go over to the hard fail. So this is the top level of the hard fail. Basically, if they meet the filter criteria of deadline passed, they're going to get the hard fail of deadline passed on their before they submit. And I'm going to start at the very bottom of the nest of subquery exports and work our way up. So at the very bottom part, I want to look for the applicant's app entry term plus their app academic program. So what I'm looking for is summer psychology, the term plus the program. Then what I'm doing the next level up, I'm taking that term and program. I'm also exporting the translation value, which is actually this value that's been found in the translation code. And I'm looking for whatever's on the applicant record to equal the value on the translation code. From here, if they meet those filters, of the program term equaling the translation. Then I want it to export the value of the deadline. And then I'm going to compare the deadline to the current date. And if the current date is greater than the deadline, then they meet the hard fail. So again, it's a little bit tricky when you first set it up, but once you start doing it, it's super easy. And again, you can just maintain all of your deadlines in one place. So another thing, translation codes work really well for this need, but if you want, you can take it a step further and house your deadlines in a data set. So here's an example from our friends at UNC Charlotte Graduate School who added all of their programs in a data set. When you click into a program, you can see details like concentration, degree, number of recommenders, etc. All things that can also be referenced elsewhere in Slate, like checklist rules or integration exports. You'll also see this entity of deadlines, which has been very helpful since each term for each program has a different deadline. So again, similar to the translation code, but you're just able to get more information in one place. Another good use case for a data set is being able to relate to other data sets like faculty and directors, which can house a whole different section of data points. Building out an entire data set is really beneficial if you use it to its fullest advantage. Otherwise, it just may be more than you really need. Start simple and then advance over time, which is really what I'd say about deadlines in general. If you have the ability and influence to do so, start your entire process by seeing where you can consolidate deadlines. If there are 150 unique deadlines across all programs, use this time to influence change, and maybe you can get everyone to agree on only a few deadlines per year. But regardless, at least you know you have options in Slate. So now that you've gotten well underway with your build, it's time to start getting users into the system. Giving users the resources they need will ensure the buy-in that is so key to successful implementations and adoption of a system. So the first is training. Training is absolutely essential for obtaining buy-in from stakeholders. If they don't know how to use the system, they're not going to want to use the system. So how to approach training? Consider timing and format of training. For admissions users and processors, you most likely need to get them trained earlier on in the process. If you wait until everything is implemented to train them, you'll be stuck needing to spend a lot of intensive time training directly, and you'll also probably get a lot of feedback that could have been useful throughout the implementation. As you implement each area, train on each area. For faculty and readers who will be more focused on one or two specific tasks, having as much built out before training is usually best. They're not the ones who need to get bogged down in the technical aspects of Slate, so showing them a half-built product could be jarring and make them less confident in the system. After the initial implementation and training, create an onboarding and training process or program and an annual refresher, which is actually really great to do after Summit, after you've learned all these new things. Another thing to consider is how to access resources. So definitely give everyone access to the knowledge base. They may not ever use it, but at least it's there and you're able to send them that way if they have any questions and you know that they really like learning that stuff. Also create handy documentation that's easily accessible through things like the Slate Scholar. So Slate Scholar is something that exists in your system. You just have to add your documentation directly there. And on each screen, you'll see a light bulb. If they're on a screen about events, put an events documentation in there and they can click on it and see your notes about events. Some schools have created websites like Binghamton's Treasure Box. This is super cool. You can Google it and find all of their documentation, and it's something that everyone at their school has access to as well. And you can also use the learning management system. So Kayla, you want to talk us through your process here?
Sure. I have to give credit where credit is due on this one. This was definitely the baby of our Director of Graduate Admissions. She had found a Canvas community to be really useful at her previous institution for supporting her faculty and staff through a summer bridge program. And so when she moved into her role, she said, these graduate program directors need a place for community. And so she created just that. So she encourages them to ask questions through the discussion board. She posts updates from graduate admissions. And because they're using Canvas every day in their daily life, we wanted to meet them where they were. And so we just kind of piggybacked on top of that and started posting our documentation as it became available.
I love that, because I think it's one thing to teach them a system, but it's also another thing to teach them a learning tool for that new system. So if you can already use something that exists, that's super beneficial. So no matter how much you train people on Slate, you still may want to make the user experience incredibly straightforward, especially for faculty and users who may not be on Slate as regularly as others. Some schools like DeSales University opt for faculty portals as a one-stop shop for their faculty and front-end users. So why create a faculty portal? It's completely customizable. So clear the clutter. You don't need to include any of the tools that they'll never use. Focus specifically on reports, searching for students, reading, etc. Less training is needed because the portal is built to speak directly to them. So it should be incredibly easy to use. It gives access to view and enter data, but is controlled by the database managers. So if you want to allow for users to add interactions, but only certain types, you can include a form on the portal that only gives them the option to submit those specific interactions. If you want users to search for applicants, but you don't want them to see certain data points that you could maybe create potential bias during their review process, don't include those data points in the exports. You don't have to recreate everything in Slate though. You can use the portal to directly link to readers, scheduler, events, registration lists, etc. Some considerations, just as you are thinking about building a portal. Faculty may already currently be comfortable with the back end of Slate, so moving to a portal could be some change that they will have to deal with. Who's going to make decisions on what is in the portal, as well as who's going to maintain the portal? That's just another thing to maintain, but if you do set it right, hopefully it's not too much maintenance. And then just where on the priority list does this live? It might not be something you want to do year one, but it could be something that once you feel comfortable in Slate, you can get into and start building. So here's a great example of our DeSales University faculty portal. You can see that they start with some recent admits. They can go to their applicants, click on an applicant there. From here, you can see most recent interactions and log an interaction. That'll take you to an interaction form. You can see you're not selecting an interaction type because it's already, again, been selected for you and hidden. So I met with Dexter. He's a good applicant. Dexter's my dog, so hopefully he'll get in. And if I click it, then I will see that interaction directly from there. I can also go see some event registration history. So just general information that I think is helpful. You can also see that there's links to the event scheduler, reader, and forms, as I mentioned. There's also a link at the above that says special list request form. This is an internal form that if a faculty doesn't see a list that they particularly want, they could submit that request for that list, and the administrators will be able to make that for them. So speaking of administrative forms, that's our next topic. So maybe you're not ready to build a full portal, but you still want to control access without creating bottlenecks in processes. Using administrative forms are particularly helpful. So here's an example of using forms to give users access to upload certain materials to a student record. So I'm on this applicant's record. I have a pop-up that will show them the materials that I want them to be able to submit. I'm going to go ahead and submit an essay. And as soon as I submit it, it will show up on the applicant's record. Another thing you can do is waive checklist items. So if you have checklist items that your faculty and administrative staff can select and waive, you can do this through a form rather than give them direct access to updating the checklist. And this allows for them to submit details about why they're doing this. Once they submit, a rule has been created to look for that form. So English proficiency exam, and through that rule, they will be marked as waived. Another great use case is collecting app requirements. So Kayla, do you want to talk about your app requirement form?
Absolutely. So This was a lessons learned. This is our first lessons learned preview for later on in the presentation. But during my implementation, I met with each of my program directors individually and collected their application requirements by pen and paper. And I quickly realized I never wanted to do that again. So moving into my second app cycle, I really advocated for the use of a standardized process that would allow all of our faculty to submit their application requirements once a year for the upcoming application cycle. Honestly, a very selfish project. I really thought the outcome would be me being able to build out the application checklist rules and make any adjustments to the forms that were needed. But there were a couple unexpected wins through the use of this form. One of which is that I found our frontline staff start utilizing this for troubleshooting with questions regarding deadlines or requirements by program, both questions from faculty and from students. Some of our frontline staff think this is a little bit easier to navigate than our website. Also, by requiring departments to submit their requirements once a year, we were really able to standardize the process and uphold an equitability in the admissions experience across fall, spring, and summer. And we had the support of our provost to ensure that program directors were considering students for fall and spring with the same criteria. And then now, if those requirements do change throughout the year, there is an exceptions process, and we document that here on this form with form fields and form communication.
And similarly, MIT has been using a form that's not currently in Slate yet, but as they've been onboarding people into implementing Slate, they've been using this form. Lauren, do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. So we didn't know what we didn't know when mechanical engineering was implementing, but we knew that we need a way to kind of track customizations in both the application and the reading bins for programs who would come on board next. So as Laura mentioned, we just developed a quick shareable Google Doc intake form for programs who are interested in the transition. And then also, instead of making people kind of sketch out their reading bin process, which you saw earlier, we just decided to make a template in PowerPoint that people could kind of move bins around and rename. And so we've asked folks to, complete these 2 items and then have a meeting with us before we kind of transition them into Slate. And so what's been great though is that most departments ask, what does it look like for MECI? So it's nice to be able to kind of show them that application and show them that reading bin and then say, okay, tell us what it would look like for you.
So no matter what resources you make, remember that they only remain useful if they're accurate. Make sure to invest time in maintaining them, do an annual audit, and make it part of your cycle prep to keep these up to date. All right, so I'm going to be done talking and give Lauren the stage here and talk a little bit about some lessons learned.
Sure. So the first one is we're still learning our lessons. And so we've had one full cycle, as I've mentioned, with one program. And so, all of our lessons and we're kind of documenting and thinking about ways to help improve the process. But I think one of the main things that we found was the help from Carnegie was essential, really. We had imposed a very tight deadline on ourselves that I think would have been hard to meet just because Laura was able to really take those sketches and all the, information from MECI and create an application and a reader bin flow for us. And so this really would have taken us much longer on our own. Sorry, I'm having issues. But the other piece was, as I've mentioned earlier, was just, it's been super helpful to just onboard one program and focus on that one program and then scale up. So yeah, just having programs to be able to see what things look like for MECI has been super helpful. And then just sort of kind of that word of mouth, like, oh, this is what they've been able to do, has really been helpful for us as well. The other thing is, permissions. Sorry, I'm just looking through my notes. We actually had a challenging faculty member on our implementation team. And so what we know now is that we can ask those questions ahead of time and like where faculty actually needs to be involved. So the intake form has really helped with that. And then just thinking about like permissions and not getting it right the first time. We did have one faculty reader who was just kind of moving people in between bins because MECI gave everyone pretty wide permission. And so we have to move people back into different bins. But so now we know we need to really, we've been sketching that out about what those custom permissions would be. And we also have programs that want to have students provide input during the application process. So thinking about what a student view would look like. So that was just kind of a helpful thing to know, that we really need to think about permissions and kind of sketch them out. And then also kind of ask programs who wanted to transition, who were the different types of audiences that they would have looking at applications.
Thanks, Lauren. And Kayla.
Yeah, so I mean, we're in a different spot than Lauren. I'm in year 4, and so we're absolutely still learning. But a couple of things that we have learned along the way. First is to anticipate faculty turnover and plan accordingly. When I started my implementation, I had a list of all those program directors. Remember, I told you I met with them individually, crazy. But prior to that, when we were ready to roll them out or roll them, for training, I scheduled a number of group sessions. I was like, yes, 30 people in a room, perfect. But of course, some of those individuals couldn't make those sessions. So I just started accommodating their schedule and training them individually. Well, the semester goes on, and the requests kept coming in. Committee members, admin coordinators, the real unsung heroes of graduate admissions, department chairs, other people who need Slate access. And I just kept continuing to train them individually. So with no prior graduate admissions experience, I was woefully underprepared for the number of people who would need system access and how often those people would change. So if you don't want to have to explain how to navigate the reader over and over again, plan ahead and invest time into those resources to support your users. In addition to the materials and documentation that Laura went through earlier today, you may also consider adopting an intake form to manage program director changes and new access requests, especially if your institution is a similar size to Ball State. On our user access form, we collect the minimum information needed to create a user, and then we use that to initiate the scheduled training with that individual. So you may be wondering, why, after all these years, are you still training users individually? But for our Slate team, our Slate duo, we just haven't been able to prioritize an alternate training model. So here we are. Which leads seamlessly into my last lesson learned. Slate does not build itself, and it requires the resources to support it. So for Ball State, we did not utilize an implementation partner, and we gave ourselves a pretty tight turnaround. So we isolated ourselves for 3 months to prepare for our application launch. But once everything went live and things went back to normal, we had full-time jobs to get back to. And for me, that was supporting our application processing team that was utilizing a brand new system. And we quickly realized that this model was not sustainable, but it took us over a year to convince our leadership that Slate needed and deserved full-time support. So then it took another year for the shift in responsibilities to finally occur. So there we were, 2 years into our relationship with Slate, and we finally had full-time support, and our requests were flooding in. By this point, our users were becoming more familiar with the system, and they expected customization, enhancements, new features, all that jazz. And 2 dedicated staff members just wasn't enough for an institution of our size. So to date, we still only have 2 full-time team members supporting our instance, but I am happy to share that we are growing, finally. In the fall, we worked with a consulting firm, and they recommended an org chart of about 6 to 9 team members for an institution of our size and structure, and we have leadership support to start hiring out that team. And so we are so excited that about the impact that additional resources will have on our ability to take Slate to the next level. And if you're in the market for a new challenge, we are shamelessly hiring for 4 positions as we speak. So come see me later. But all of that to say, if you haven't implemented yet, think critically about your team structure and make sure you have the right people in the room when decisions are being made. And if a Slate team is not feasible at your institution, then I strongly encourage you to advocate for an implementation partner like Carnegie to help you get things up and running.
Thank you for sharing. And I did not tell Lauren or Kayla to talk about us like that, but I did totally agree. We love to help people, and we know that there's so much support that y'all need, because a lot of times this is not your full-time job. So, all right. So this isn't live, so we're not going to do Q&As, but here's our contact information.